I had been looking forward to summer vacation for months. After a long school year that felt like it stretched endlessly, I finally had 2 months completely free, and I wanted to spend them somewhere different, somewhere away from the noise and busyness of my town. I didn't want a typical beach holiday crowded with tourists or a resort full of families with screaming kids. I wanted quiet, I wanted freedom, and I wanted to push myself a little beyond the comfort of everyday life. That was how I ended up deciding to go alone to a remote lakeside cabin in the mountains, a place I had found in a small rental listing online. The cabin was old, simple, and far enough from the nearest road that I would have to hike for about an hour through the forest just to get there. That was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, peace, and a chance to test myself. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through narrow roads lined with dense forest on both sides. The sun was strong and hot, typical of mid-July, but the forest offered shade in patches. I had packed lightly, a backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a week, a small first aid kit, and a handheld GPS device. I wanted to keep things simple, and I wanted to rely on my own abilities. There was a thrill in being completely responsible for myself, knowing that if something went wrong, I could only rely on my own skills. The hike began smoothly. The path was clear, lined with wildflowers, and the air smelled like pine and earth. Birds called in the distance, and a few squirrels darted across the trail. I felt completely alive, breathing in the hot, clean mountain air. By the time I reached a small stream halfway through, I stopped to rest. I knelt by the water, cupping it in my hands, and drank, feeling the cold liquid slide down my throat. I didn't see anyone else. I didn't hear cars or motorcycles, just the forest and me. By mid-afternoon, the sun was dipping slightly, and I could see the lake through the trees. The view took my breath away. The water was dark but clear, reflecting the sky like glass. I followed the path down the last stretch, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. When I finally reached the cabin, it was everything I expected. Weathered wood, slightly crooked walls, and a rusted metal roof. A small dock stretched into the lake, half sunken in one spot. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust, the kind of smell that always clings to places left alone for months. I spent the first day setting up. I unpacked my things, laid out my sleeping bag inside the cabin, and checked that I had enough firewood. The forest was calm, but there was a quiet tension to it, like the kind you feel when you know you're being watched but don't know by what. I tried not to think about it too much. I made myself a simple meal of canned beans and bread, then sat on the dock watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The water glimmered, and a light breeze rippled across the surface. It was beautiful, but the isolation made me feel small in a way I hadn't expected. That night, I slept in the cabin, listening to the forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of something moving in the water, but I slept deeply, too tired from the hike to worry. The next morning, I woke early. Summer mornings in the mountains are crisp, and the air smelled of dew and pine needles. I decided to spend the day exploring the area. There was a trail I hadn't noticed the day before, winding up the hillside behind the cabin. I followed it, enjoying the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and dry leaves. At first, the hike was easy, but as the path became steeper, I realized it had not been maintained for years. The undergrowth was thick, and I had to push branches aside to move forward. At one point, I lost the trail entirely and had to backtrack, my heart racing not from exertion, but from the realization that I could get lost. By late afternoon, I had made it to a small clearing with a view of the lake from above. The water looked smaller from here, like a dark, glassy mirror hidden among the trees. I rested for a while, eating a granola bar and drinking water. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. On the opposite side of the clearing, there were footprints in the soft earth. Human footprints. They weren't old, they had been made recently. My stomach tightened. I knew this area was remote, and I hadn't seen anyone else since I parked my car at the trailhead. I stood, scanning the treeline, listening. Nothing moved. I couldn't see anyone, and yet the prints were there, fresh, leading further up the hill. I debated whether to follow them. My instincts told me not to, but my curiosity got the better of me. I moved quietly, trying to stay on the edge of the clearing. The prints led to a series of smaller trails that twisted through dense underbrush. I followed them carefully, and that's when I realized something more disturbing. The prints didn't just go in one direction. They circled. There was no clear path. They looped around, disappearing and reappearing as if someone or something had been wandering back and forth, watching. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up. I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe someone who lived in the area, but there had been no signs of people, no discarded bottles, no broken branches from someone carrying gear. Nothing, just the prints. I decided it was time to go back. I retraced my steps carefully, making mental notes of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. When I reached the clearing again, the prints were gone, vanished. I felt a cold wave of fear. Someone had been there, following me or waiting, and now they were gone. I hurried down the trail toward the cabin, my boots slipping on loose dirt, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the cabin, everything looked normal. Nothing was disturbed. I told myself I was imagining things, that it had probably been an animal, but the shape and size of the prints didn't match anything I knew. That night, I slept lightly, leaving the door to the cabin locked and checking the windows multiple times. Every sound outside, an animal scurrying, the wind in the trees, made me flinch. Around midnight, I was woken by a sudden sound. It wasn't the forest sounds I had gotten used to. It was deliberate, a crunch of footsteps on gravel outside the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Then came a long silence. I didn't move, my body tense, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. I could feel my heart in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, slowly, moving along the perimeter of the cabin, stopping occasionally. Whoever it was, they were circling the cabin, waiting, observing. I stayed awake until dawn, watching through the window. When the first light hit the forest, the footsteps stopped. I could see the outlines of trees and the lake, calm and still, but I knew the presence hadn't vanished entirely. I spent the morning checking my gear, thinking through ways to defend myself, and considering packing up and leaving. But there was something stubborn in me that wanted to see this through. I couldn't just abandon the cabin without knowing. The following days were tense. I kept my fire going during the night, the crackling flames casting long shadows across the walls. I made sure food was stored securely, hanging it from a tree to keep it out of reach. Each day, I hiked further into the surrounding forest, marking my path carefully. I saw more signs of human presence. Scraps of cloth caught in branches, a discarded water bottle, a makeshift fire pit that looked recent. Someone had been living or camping nearby without my knowledge. The thought made my stomach churn. I never saw the person, but I could feel them watching, following my movements at a distance. It was on the 5th day that the encounter happened. I had decided to explore the far side of the lake, where the trail was less visible and the forest denser. The sun was low, turning the sky a golden orange. I walked along a narrow path when I saw movement ahead. A figure emerged from the trees. I froze. It was a man, thin, wearing dark clothing, carrying a backpack. He didn't say anything. He just stopped, staring at me. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. My heart pounded. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the trees, moving quickly and silently. I didn't chase him. I knew better. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? How long had he been watching me? Why hadn't he approached directly? I fortified the cabin further, making sure every door and window was secure, and that night I slept in shifts, never fully letting my guard down. The days dragged on. Each time I left the cabin, I felt that same presence, lingering at the edge of my vision. But I also noticed patterns. The man, or whoever he was, avoided me if I made noise, if I moved quickly, if I stayed aware. I realized that he wasn't a random attacker. He was cautious, maybe even respectful in a strange, unsettling way. But the fear never left. By the end of the 2nd week, I had become hyper-aware of everything around me. Every crack of a branch, every ripple on the lake, Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt. I remember that summer more vividly than any other. I had just finished my last year of high school, and the sense of freedom was intoxicating. My parents had insisted I take a break from city life, and I convinced them to let me spend a few weeks at a small, isolated cabin in the mountains, far away from the noise and chaos. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a wooden structure, slightly weathered but still solid, tucked away on the edge of a dense forest, with a narrow dirt road leading to it. There was a small stream nearby, the kind that whispered through the rocks and gave the air a damp, earthy smell that made me feel alive in a way the city never could. The first few days were perfect. I spent them hiking along the narrow trails, sometimes wandering too far, but never too worried. I had packed enough food, a map, a compass, and plenty of water. At night, the stars seemed brighter than anywhere else I had ever been. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees or the far-off call of some bird I couldn't identify. It was peaceful, almost meditative. I spent hours lying on the grass near the stream, staring at the sky and feeling like I was part of some secret world that no one else had access to. On the fourth day, I decided to take a hike deeper into the forest. I had noticed a narrow trail branching off the main path, half hidden by overgrown bushes. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took it. First, it was easy, almost too easy. The trail was well worn, and it led me to a small clearing where sunlight poured in through the canopy, highlighting patches of moss and clusters of wildflowers. I sat there for a while, resting and enjoying the feeling of being utterly alone. But then I noticed something odd. The trail behind me had started to fade. Not just fade in the way a path does when you haven't used it in years, but in a way that suggested I might have wandered off it entirely without realizing it. I thought I could find my way back by retracing my steps, but the forest seemed to shift around me. Every time I turned around, the angle of the sunlight looked slightly different, and the same clusters of trees appeared in places where they shouldn't have been. A slow, creeping sense of unease settled over me. I kept walking, hoping to find some landmark or familiar trail. Hours passed. My water supply was running low, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the thick canopy. The forest had grown denser, and the air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and decaying wood. I realized I had no idea which direction led back to the cabin. Panic started to creep in. My breaths grew shallow, and my legs ached from walking on uneven ground. As darkness fell, I stumbled upon a small, abandoned campsite. A rusted metal pot lay near a fire pit, and a few tattered pieces of cloth were strewn across the ground. It looked like someone had been there long ago and left in a hurry. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from the cold, though the temperature had dropped, but from the realization that I was completely alone in a part of the forest that probably hadn't seen human presence in years. I decided to make camp for the night. I gathered some dry leaves and twigs, trying to start a fire. My lighter flickered and died several times, and by the time I managed a small flame, darkness had swallowed the forest completely. I huddled near the fire, my backpack under my head, trying to sleep, but every rustle in the trees made my heart jump. The noises of the forest, which had been comforting during the day, now sounded menacing. Every branch snapping, every distant thump, made me imagine something moving just beyond the circle of firelight. I told myself it was only the wind or small animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point during the night, I woke to the sound of something moving just beyond the firelight. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching leaves in a rhythm that didn't match the random sounds of the forest. My first instinct was to stay completely still, holding my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving slowly in a circle around my camp. I could hear heavy breathing, shallow and tense, almost matching my own. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I wanted to scream, but my voice would have carried into the darkness, and I had no way of knowing if I was truly alone or if there was someone, or something, out there. Hours passed in that agonizing tension. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, jittery, and dehydrated. I waited for the sun to rise higher before attempting to move, and when I finally did, I realized how far I had wandered. The trees were unfamiliar, the landmarks unrecognizable. My sense of direction, which I had relied on for years, had betrayed me completely. Panic returned in waves, but I forced myself to move, sticking to what little sunlight filtered through the branches, hoping it would guide me in some direction. I stumbled across a small creek and decided to follow it, thinking it might lead me to a larger body of water or a trail. The water was cold and refreshing. I drank sparingly, careful not to get sick. Following the creek felt like the safest choice, even though the forest around it was dense and almost oppressive. Hours passed, and I began to notice signs that someone else had been there recently. Broken branches, footprints in the mud, and even a few discarded cans. Each discovery made my heart race, and every shadow seemed to move with intent. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or multiple people, were tracking me as much as I was trying to find my way out. By late afternoon, my legs were burning, my throat raw from dry air, and my stomach grumbling from lack of food. I forced myself to keep going, following the creek. Eventually, the terrain changed, and I found myself at the edge of a cliff overlooking a valley. From that height, I could see smoke rising in the distance. My heart leapt. Civilization. I scrambled down the rocky slope as carefully as I could, bloodied and exhausted, praying the smoke came from a place that could help me. The smoke led me to a small logging camp. There were a few trucks, stacked logs, and men working with chainsaws and axes. I waved frantically, and one of the workers noticed me. Relief flooded through me in waves I can't even describe. They brought me water, food, and a radio to call for help. I learned that I had been lost for nearly 3 full days. During that time, search teams had been looking for me, and the camp had been informed by the local authorities. I felt a mix of shame, relief, and lingering terror. When I was finally driven back to the cabin, the forest seemed almost welcoming again in the light of day, but I couldn't shake the memory of those long hours, walking in circles, hearing footsteps and breaths that weren't my own. I realized how unprepared I had been. I had underestimated the forest, its ability to confuse, its isolation, and its quiet menace. The sense of freedom I had felt at the beginning of the trip was replaced with a deep respect for the wilderness, and a lingering fear that I might have been alone, but not entirely safe. Over the next few days, I stayed at the cabin, too shaken to go back into the forest. I spent my time examining the trails I had taken, marking them on a map, and reflecting on how quickly everything had spiraled. I understood something essential about the forest. It was indifferent. It wasn't malicious, and it wasn't friendly. It simply existed, and I had been unprepared for its scale, its quiet dangers, and the absolute isolation it imposed. When I finally returned home, I was different. The memory of that summer stayed with me, haunting in subtle ways. I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it would have been to get lost permanently, how quickly fear could consume me, and how small and vulnerable I had been. I realized that nature, in its raw form, doesn't bend to human desire or need. It's vast, unpredictable, and patient, and sometimes being alone in it is the scariest thing imaginable. I never went back to that cabin. The thought of it still sends a shiver down my spine. But that summer taught me lessons I could never have learned elsewhere. Patience, preparation, and a respect for the quiet dangers of the world. And though the fear lingered, it also gave me a sense of clarity, an understanding of limits, survival, and the fragility of the human experience when faced with the raw, indifferent power of the natural world. Even now, years later, whenever I hear the wind rustling through trees, I feel the memory of that isolation and the subtle terror of being completely, utterly alone. And I am grateful that I survived, and grateful that I learned that some freedom comes at the cost of confronting the true scale of the world around us. I had been looking forward to this summer vacation for months. The thought of leaving the city, its smog, the endless noise, and the suffocating routine filled me with a sense of freedom I hadn't felt all year. My parents had rented a small cabin by a lake, tucked into a dense forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. The drive itself was already an adventure. The roads narrowed, bending around hills and thick clusters of trees. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting restless shadows across the asphalt. By the time we reached the cabin, the air was noticeably cooler, scented with pine, damp soil, and the faint tang of the lake. The cabin looked small but solid, a wooden structure with a slanted roof and a porch that overlooked the water. Its windows were slightly dusty, but it seemed sturdy, and from the outside, it felt private, isolated in a way that excited me. I carried my backpack, filled with the essentials: books, a flashlight, snacks, and my notebook. I had decided I would document everything that happened this summer, both for fun and to have a record of the experience, whatever it turned out to be. The first day passed slowly, in a comfortable, almost lazy way. My parents unpacked, arranged things in the kitchen and bedrooms, and I spent most of my time exploring the perimeter of the cabin. The forest stretched thickly in all directions, a mix of tall pines and broadleaf trees, their roots tangled and rising above the ground in gnarled patterns. I walked along a faint trail that led toward the lake. The water was clearer than I expected, shimmering under the sun, with fish darting just beneath the surface. The quiet was almost absolute. Apart from the occasional bird call or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, there was nothing. It felt both peaceful and slightly unnerving. By the second day, I had decided to venture further into the forest, moving beyond the marked trails near the cabin. I told myself it was just curiosity, wanting to see how far I could go. But there was a subtle thrill in the idea of being truly alone in the woods. I packed a small bag with water, some snacks, my camera, and a compass. The sun was high when I started walking, but the trees cast deep shadows that made it cooler under the canopy. I kept track of landmarks, large rocks, and unusual trees, knowing I needed to be able to find my way back. Hours passed, and I found myself deeper than I had intended. The forest became denser, the trees growing closer together, the underbrush thick and occasionally scraping against my legs. I was moving cautiously, paying attention to sounds and keeping my eyes on the ground for uneven roots or stones. Eventually, I came across a small clearing. The ground was soft with moss, and a few wildflowers grew in scattered patches. It looked untouched, like no one had been here in years. I stopped to take a photo, crouching carefully on the moss. It was around that time that I first noticed the footprints. They were faint, pressed into the damp soil of the clearing, large and deep. My first thought was that they were from some kind of animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the shape didn't match anything I recognized. They had 5 toes, but they were unusually long and narrow. Something about them didn't sit right. I followed the prints slowly, trying not to make any noise, moving deeper into the forest. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and twisted, with roots sprawling across the ground like thick veins. The prints led me to a small stream. I paused there, kneeling by the water to drink and refill my bottle. That's when I noticed other signs: broken branches, disturbed leaves, and faint marks on the bark of the trees. Claw-like scratches, though not deep enough to be dangerous, just enough to notice. My heart began to beat faster. I realized I wasn't alone in this part of the forest, though I couldn't see anyone. The idea of turning back crossed my mind, but curiosity kept me moving, just a little further. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip. Shadows grew long and the air cooled. I realized I had no idea where I was. The landmarks I had used earlier looked different in the fading light, and every turn seemed unfamiliar. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I retraced my steps to the stream, thinking I could follow it back to a known trail. But the forest was playing tricks. The path I thought I remembered didn't exist, and every direction seemed equally alien. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. Small twigs snapped in the distance, leaves rustled without wind, and I could hear faint dripping sounds, like water falling somewhere unseen. I kept moving, trying to orient myself, but darkness fell quickly in the forest. The flashlight in my bag had weak batteries, and I had only brought it as a backup. Eventually, I stopped in a small clearing, trying to breathe and gather my thoughts. That's when I saw it: movement, just at the edge of the shadows. Something was watching me. I froze. The shape was dark, low to the ground, but I couldn't make out what it was. I thought of running, but the terrain was uneven, and I didn't want to trip in the dark. I decided to climb a small rise to get a better view. As I crested it, the movement stopped. Whatever it was, it had disappeared, leaving no trace. My mind raced, imagining possibilities, wild animals, another hiker, but I didn't hear anyone calling out. Nothing. I decided it was safest to try to find a high point where I could see the surrounding area and maybe find a trail back. I moved cautiously, slipping in mud and brushing against branches, my heart pounding. Every shadow seemed alive. Eventually, I found a ridge with a slightly clearer view. From there, I could see the faint glimmer of the lake far below, reflecting the moonlight. Relief surged through me. I could orient myself and head back. I moved carefully, retracing the general direction, staying close to ridges and avoiding thick underbrush. My legs ached, my hands were scratched from branches, and my clothes were damp with sweat and mud, but the thought of the cabin kept me going. It was well past midnight when I finally stumbled onto a recognizable trail. The path led down to the lake, and soon I could see the faint outline of the cabin in the moonlight. I ran the last stretch, slipping and sliding in the dirt, but finally reaching the porch, gasping for air. My parents were awake, having worried when I didn't return. I didn't speak much, only collapsing into a chair, shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin, wary of venturing into the forest alone. I thought about the footprints, the movement, and the feeling of being watched. Whatever it had been, I had never seen it clearly, but it had been real. My summer continued, but the shadow of that night stayed with me. The awareness that even in beautiful, serene places, nature had hidden dangers and mysteries that could turn a perfect summer into a nightmare. I never went that deep into the forest again, but I kept the notebook, filled with sketches of the footprints and the layout of the trails, as a reminder of what I had survived and the reality that the wild could be unpredictable, terrifying, and utterly indifferent to humans. I had been looking forward to summer vacation for months, imagining long days outside, swimming in the river, and exploring the woods behind my uncle's old house. The house was in a small town far from the city, a place where the air smelled different, heavier, and where you could hear birds, insects, and the wind more clearly than car horns or sirens. I had always loved nature, but that summer, I would learn just how fragile and dangerous it could feel when you were alone. My uncle's house was old, made of wood that creaked in every storm. The paint was peeling, and some of the steps on the front porch had rotted away, making them uneven. When I arrived, the air felt thick and warm. It was the kind of heat that made your clothes stick to your skin, and the sun beat down so strongly that the shadows seemed to shrink. I carried my bag inside, trying to ignore the strange smell of mildew mixed with old wood, and set my things down in the room at the end of the hallway. The room had one window that looked out over the backyard, and from it, I could see the forest begin where the grass ended. The first few days were perfect in a normal summer kind of way. I swam in the river each morning, feeling the cold water hit my skin, and explored the paths in the woods during the afternoon. Birds and squirrels moved around like they didn't care I was there, and the occasional deer would watch me quietly before running away. I found a small clearing in the woods with soft grass, a place where sunlight filtered down through the leaves. I would lie there for hours, reading or just watching the trees sway. At night, the sounds of crickets and frogs were almost soothing, and I felt completely alone but safe, the kind of solitude that feels like freedom. Then, a week into my vacation, things started to feel different. I noticed small signs that I wasn't alone in the woods in the way I had thought. At first, it was simple things. Footprints in the dirt that weren't mine, twigs broken in ways I hadn't done, and the faint smell of smoke one morning when there shouldn't have been any fire. I thought maybe some locals had a campfire, or maybe it was just someone hiking. I didn't worry. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But one evening, as I walked back from the river, I realized the feeling of being watched had become overwhelming. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see a deer or a fox, but there was nothing moving except the leaves rustling in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was normal, my mind playing tricks, but I felt my heart beat faster and my pace quickened. By the time I got to the porch, I was sweating more from fear than from the heat. I locked the door behind me, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The next day, I planned to go further into the woods than I had before. I wanted to see the old creek that twisted through the forest. The path was overgrown, thorny branches scratching my arms and legs. I wore long pants and a long-sleeve shirt, even though the sun was hot, and I carried a small knife in my pocket, more for reassurance than for any real protection. The deeper I went, the quieter the woods became. No birds sang here, no squirrels chattered. Only the wind whispered through the trees, and my own footsteps sounded too loud. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. I found the creek eventually. It was narrower than I expected, with water that smelled faintly of decay. I knelt to touch it, running my fingers through the cold flow. Then I heard it, a snap, like someone stepping on a branch. My head shot up and I froze. There was nothing in sight. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Another snap, closer this time. Then a rustle, just beyond the line of trees. My heart was hammering. I wanted to run back, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground had grown sticky. The noise stopped suddenly, and the silence was worse than the sound. I finally ran back, breaking through the branches, cutting my arms, my mind racing with every possible danger. When I reached the clearing I had found before, I saw something I couldn't ignore. A figure, crouched, almost hidden behind a tree. I couldn't tell if it was a person at first. My first thought was to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat. The figure didn't move, and after a few seconds, I ran faster, my feet barely touching the ground, until the woods thinned and I could see my uncle's house in the distance. I didn't go back to the woods that night. I stayed inside, doors locked, listening to every sound. The wind, the groaning of the old house, the distant hoot of an owl, but no footsteps. I slept fitfully, nightmares of someone in the trees following me, watching me, climbing closer. The next morning, I debated whether to leave, but something inside me refused to give in. I had come for adventure, and I wasn't going to run away without knowing what was out there. The following day, I decided to prepare. I brought water, food, a first aid kit, and a small flashlight, though I hoped not to need it in daylight. I moved slowly, listening carefully to every sound. Hours passed with nothing, and I began to relax slightly. Maybe the previous day had just been a trick of nerves. But as the sun began to sink, casting long shadows through the trees, I realized I had wandered further than I had ever intended. The creek twisted in ways I didn't remember, and I knew I had no clear path back. Panic crept in. Then I heard it again, the snap of a branch, slow and deliberate. I froze, heart pounding. The rustling grew closer. I realized I was not alone. I looked around frantically for a way out, but the trees and underbrush seemed endless. My mind raced with possibilities. If it was a person, what did they want? Were they dangerous? The logical part of me wanted to call out, to shout for help, but another part knew that making noise might be the worst thing. I remembered my uncle's advice about staying calm in nature. I crouched low, trying to make myself small, hoping the figure would pass. But then, I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. It wasn't fast, but deliberate. I could make out the faint outline of a man, tall, thin, moving slowly as if watching me carefully. I stayed still, counting my breaths. My hands shook. I had no weapon that could help if he came close, only the small knife in my pocket. Hours seemed to pass. The figure stayed at a distance, circling, never fully leaving, never coming too close. I realized I couldn't stay hidden forever. The sun was sinking too low. My only chance was to move quietly, stick to the shadows, and hope he didn't notice me. I waited until the figure moved behind a large tree, then ran. Branches tore at my clothes and skin. My shoes slipped in the mud by the creek. I stumbled but kept going, never looking back. I emerged from the forest just as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. My uncle's house was in sight, and I ran the last stretch, heart hammering, lungs burning. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police from the old rotary phone in the kitchen. Took a while for them to arrive. When they did, they searched the woods but found no one. They said it was likely someone living in the forest, watching, maybe even following people for a while before leaving when they sensed they were discovered. They couldn't find him. That night, I slept with every door and window locked. I didn't leave the house again for the rest of my vacation. I watched the woods from the window, always alert, imagining that shadow among the trees. It left me shaken, scared, and aware of how vulnerable we really are when alone in nature. The freedom I had felt at the start of the summer disappeared. I understood then that adventure has a price, that curiosity can lead you to danger, and that some people might be hiding where you least expect. When my parents finally came to pick me up, I felt relief I hadn't known I was craving. The drive back to the city felt safe, the crowded streets comforting. I never went back to that summer spot, but the memory stayed. I remember the heat, the smells, the cold of the creek, the feeling of being watched, and most of all, the lesson I learned. Nature can be beautiful and peaceful, but there is always an element of risk, especially when humans are involved. I came home alive, but changed, more aware of how quickly safety can slip away, how silence can be dangerous, and how summer vacations are not always just fun and freedom. They can also test you in ways you never imagined. I had been looking forward to this summer vacation for months. It wasn't about escaping school or parents. It was about the freedom I felt when I was far from home, when my only responsibility was waking up with the sun and deciding how to spend the day. That year, my parents agreed to let me stay at a small cabin near Lake Sylvan, a place far from the noisy streets and crowded beaches, a place surrounded by dense woods and steep hills. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was old and smelled faintly of damp wood and pine, but it was mine for 2 whole weeks, and that was enough. The first morning, I woke to the smell of wet earth and smoke from the fireplace, where I had left some leftover wood burning low. The sun had barely climbed over the hills, but already the air was hot and heavy, the kind of heat that made the leaves hang still and the lake shimmer with a mirage-like shine. I stepped outside barefoot on the wooden deck, feeling the rough planks beneath my feet, and I noticed the fog lifting off the lake, revealing the shallow shore. Mist hovered like a low cloud above the water, curling around the reeds and the stumps of old trees that had fallen long ago. I spent the morning exploring the edge of the lake. The shoreline was rocky and slippery with algae, and the water was colder than I expected, biting my feet as I stepped in. I found sticks that were smooth from being tumbled in the water, stones that were heavy and perfectly shaped for skipping, and strange markings in the mud where birds or small mammals had passed. I didn't see anyone else for hours. The quiet was so complete that it felt almost like the world had paused, leaving me alone to move through it. By midday, the heat became oppressive. I retreated to the cabin, stripping down to shorts and a t-shirt and pouring myself a glass of water from the metal jug I kept in the fridge. Even inside, the air was thick, and the ceiling fan barely stirred it. I decided to take a short nap, leaving the windows open so the slight breeze from the lake could reach me. I slept lightly, half awake, hearing the soft hum of insects outside, the occasional rustle of branches as squirrels chased each other across the treetops. When I woke, the sun was lower, and the woods were beginning to darken under the long shadows of late afternoon. That's when I noticed something odd. A series of footprints led away from the cabin and toward the edge of the forest. They were heavy, deep impressions, not like the light prints left by birds or deer. I frowned. No one else was supposed to be here, and I didn't hear a car arrive. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed them, careful not to step in them exactly so I wouldn't disturb the pattern. The prints led into the woods, where the canopy thickened and the temperature dropped. Sunlight filtered through in narrow streaks, and the ground was littered with leaves, pine needles, and broken twigs. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet. Each step made a soft crack underfoot, and every small sound, like the flutter of a bird or the snap of a twig, made me tense. The footprints moved in a straight line, as if whoever had made them knew exactly where they were going. I followed them for almost an hour, my legs aching from climbing over roots and rocks, until they stopped abruptly near a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. It was surrounded by tall pines, the kind whose trunks were scarred with age, and in the center of the clearing, I saw it, a makeshift campsite. There was a tarp tied between two trees, a small fire pit with cold ashes, and scattered supplies. A backpack, a few cans of food, and an empty water bottle. It was clear someone had been here recently. The strange thing was that the prints didn't end at the campsite. They continued, leading further into the woods, but these ones were much lighter, smaller, and more erratic. I hesitated, feeling a tight knot of fear coil in my stomach. I wasn't sure why, but something about this felt dangerous. My first instinct was to go back, to return to the safety of the cabin and call for help, but the other part of me, the part that had spent so much time wandering alone, pushed me forward. I wanted to know who had been here. I continued, moving carefully. The forest floor became more uneven, the path less clear. Thorn bushes snagged at my clothes, and I stumbled over roots hidden under fallen leaves. The air grew cooler and damper, and I noticed a faint smell, metallic and sharp, that I couldn't place. As I rounded a bend, I saw the edge of a small pond, dark and still, reflecting the surrounding trees like a mirror. And then I saw it, a flash of movement across the water. Something large, moving quickly, almost too fast to track. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening. There was a faint sound behind me, like something heavy being dragged across the dirt. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing. But then the sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate. Someone or something was moving toward me. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, my lungs burning. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get back to the cabin. The path I had taken seemed different now, as if the forest had shifted while I wasn't looking. Branches scratched at my arms and face, and I fell more than once, scraping my knees and hands on the rough ground. The sound behind me kept pace, slow and heavy, and my fear became almost paralyzing. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it didn't matter. I had to move. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the trees and saw the glint of the lake in the distance. Relief flooded me. I ran down the slope, past the shoreline, and saw the cabin in the fading light. I sprinted across the grass, tripping over roots near the deck, and slammed the door behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the door, listening. Outside, the forest was silent again. Too silent. I spent the rest of the evening boarding up the cabin windows and keeping a heavy stick by the door. I didn't sleep well. Every sound, an animal moving in the trees, the wind brushing against the walls, made me startle. The next morning, I hesitated to go outside, but hunger forced me to venture to the fridge. I made a quick breakfast and decided I needed to explore more, to understand what had happened. I returned to the clearing where I had seen the campsite. In the daylight, it looked different. The tarp was old and torn, the fire pit cold, the supplies scattered more haphazardly. I inspected the ground carefully. The deep, heavy prints were gone, replaced by lighter marks, almost like they had been erased or covered. My unease returned, but I forced myself to follow the lighter prints again, this time with a plan. I carried a long branch in front of me, ready to defend myself if needed. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed signs of struggle. Broken branches, disturbed underbrush, and a few bloodstains on the rocks near the pond. The metallic smell was stronger now, unmistakably the scent of blood. Fear shot through me, but I also realized something. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I followed the trail until it ended near an old, abandoned cabin, barely visible through the overgrown weeds and fallen trees. The door was hanging on its hinges, the windows shattered. Inside, the floor was littered with debris, and in the corner, I saw it. A pile of clothes and a backpack, soaked and torn. There were no bodies, no signs of life, just the remnants of someone, or something, that had been here. My stomach turned, and I realized I had been lucky to escape whatever had been stalking me. I didn't stay long. I retraced my steps carefully, keeping my eyes and ears alert. I didn't hear the heavy footsteps again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally returned to my cabin, I packed my belongings quickly. I called my parents, who promised to come immediately, and within a few hours, I was on the road back home. Even weeks later, I thought about that summer vacation, about the lake and the cabin and the forest. I realized how close I had come to something dangerous, something I couldn't name. I never returned to Lake Sylvan, but I kept the memory vivid in my mind, a reminder of how thin the line can be between freedom and danger, and how quickly solitude can become terrifying. I didn't tell many people the details. Most wouldn't understand, but I never forgot the quiet fear that had chased me through the trees, and the relief that came with the sun rising over the lake, letting me know I had survived. It was the first week of summer, and I was beyond excited. I had been waiting for this break for months, imagining days spent by the lake near my uncle's old cabin in the woods. He had promised me freedom, quiet, and adventure. The cabin was miles away from any town, tucked deep into a dense forest where the air smelled of pine and dirt. My parents had been hesitant, but after assuring them I would stay safe and that my uncle would look out for me, I finally got their permission. The drive alone was long. The asphalt turned into gravel, and the gravel twisted into a barely visible dirt path that wound around hills and rivers. My uncle's truck rattled with every bump, and I could feel the tension building inside me as the trees grew thicker and taller, their branches forming almost a wall around the road. It was a warm day, the sun hanging lazily in the sky, but under the trees it felt cooler, almost dim, like the forest had its own shade that blocked out the summer glare. When we finally arrived, the cabin was even smaller than I had imagined. Its wooden exterior was weathered, some planks crooked and fading in color, but it had a strange charm. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, and the porch creaked underfoot as I stepped out of the truck. My uncle, a tall, broad man with calloused hands, handed me the key. He gave me a brief tour, showing me where the water pump was, where I could store food safely, and the small generator that provided electricity for a few hours each evening. That first night, I slept poorly. The sounds of the forest were unfamiliar. Branches scratching, leaves rustling, and an occasional distant howl that could have been a coyote. I told myself it was nothing, just the wild settling in for the night, but my stomach twisted in nervous anticipation. I hadn't realized how alive the forest could feel at night, how it could press in around you until it felt like the darkness itself was moving. The next morning, I woke early, the sunlight slanting through the gaps in the cabin walls. I had planned to explore the area, so I grabbed a backpack, a map, a compass, some food, and a small first aid kit my uncle insisted I carry. The map he gave me wasn't detailed, just enough to mark the lake, the trails, and the main dirt roads, but it was still better than nothing. I headed down a narrow trail that led into the woods, the trees arching overhead, forming a tunnel of green. At first, everything seemed normal. Birds sang, squirrels darted across the trail, and the air was cool and fresh. But after a few hours, I realized I hadn't passed any signs of human activity. No footprints, no discarded trash, nothing that indicated anyone else had been there in days. The forest was vast, quiet except for the natural sounds. That in itself was unsettling. I paused often, listening, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the wind shifting through the leaves. By midday, I reached a small clearing near a stream. The water was clear, and I bent down to drink, grateful for the cool refreshment. I sat on a moss-covered rock and ate the sandwiches I had packed. For a while, the forest felt peaceful again. But as I rested, I noticed something strange. There were marks on the trees, vertical scratches running up the bark. They weren't deep, but they were long, fresh, and sharp. I felt my heart rate speed up. I tried to think logically. Could it be bears? Possibly, but the spacing and shape didn't make sense for claws. And then I remembered what my uncle had told me. Keep your eyes open. The forest is older than you, and not everything in it wants to be seen. Shaking off the unease, I continued along the trail, telling myself I was just imagining things. The path twisted and turned, sometimes climbing steep hills, sometimes descending into shadowy valleys. Hours passed, and I started to lose my sense of direction. The map was barely useful here. The trails were unmarked, overgrown, and the landmarks I had relied on seemed to vanish. Every few minutes, I stopped to check my compass, trying to ensure I was heading back toward the lake. But the forest seemed endless, confusing, and labyrinthine. Late in the afternoon, I stumbled upon an old cabin, abandoned and falling apart. The wood was rotting, windows shattered, and the door hung on one hinge. My first instinct was to avoid it, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked around the perimeter, noticing faint signs that someone had been here recently. Footprints, small fire pits, and broken cans of food. My stomach sank. Whoever had been here wasn't there now, but the presence was recent enough to unsettle me. I felt a sudden urgency to leave, but as I turned back, I realized I had lost the trail entirely. Panic set in. The sun was low in the sky, and shadows stretched long and thin. I started walking in what I hoped was the right direction, but the forest was dense, and every tree looked the same. I tried to follow the sound of the stream I had seen earlier, but it was faint, distant. My heart pounded. I remembered my uncle's advice. If you get lost, don't run. Stay calm, make a shelter, and wait for help if you can. I cursed my lack of preparation. I had no signal on my phone, no whistle, no way to call for help beyond shouting until my voice gave out. As night fell, the forest transformed. The temperature dropped quickly, the shadows deepened, and every sound seemed amplified. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant splash of water. I stumbled over roots, my backpack catching on branches. I tried to keep moving, telling myself that I could find the cabin or the lake before it got too dark. But darkness fell faster than I anticipated, and soon I could barely see a foot in front of me. I found a small depression between two fallen trees and decided to make a temporary shelter. I gathered branches, piled them for cover, and huddled underneath, wrapping my jacket tightly around me. The night was long. Every small noise made me flinch. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, imagining everything that could be out there. Wild animals, people with bad intentions, or simply the endless darkness swallowing me whole. Around midnight, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a branch breaking under weight, not a small animal. It was deliberate, heavy, slow steps coming from the direction of the old cabin I had found. I froze, barely breathing, straining to see through the darkness. The steps stopped, then started again, circling the clearing I had chosen. I realized that whatever it was not random. Someone or something was watching me. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to be part of the forest. I remembered a trick I had read about in survival guides. Don't make noise, don't move, wait for the threat to lose interest. The minutes felt like hours. My hands were shaking, my stomach twisted in fear. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, fading into the darkness. I didn't breathe fully until I heard nothing at all. At first light, I packed my temporary shelter quickly and started moving in the opposite direction of the sounds from last night. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The forest was alive with morning sounds, birds calling, the soft rush of wind, but I couldn't let myself be distracted. I walked for hours, sometimes crawling under fallen trees, sometimes climbing over steep embankments. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at me, but the fear of being trapped in the woods alone drove me forward. Eventually, I stumbled onto a wider trail. Relief washed over me. The trail seemed more traveled, and I could see faint tire tracks, suggesting that vehicles had passed through recently. I followed it, moving faster now, adrenaline giving me strength I didn't know I had. After what felt like an endless march, I finally saw a familiar landmark, the old wooden bridge that led to the main dirt road near my uncle's cabin. Tears sprang to my eyes. I ran the last few hundred meters, stumbling over roots, not caring about the scrapes and cuts I earned along the way. When I finally reached the cabin, I collapsed on the porch, gasping for breath. My uncle rushed out when he saw me, concern written all over his face. I could barely speak, just pointing toward the woods, trying to convey the terror I had experienced. He didn't press me for details, just wrapped me in a blanket and gave me water. Over the next few days, I stayed close to the cabin, never venturing far. I realized how easy it was to get lost, how quickly the forest could turn from serene to terrifying. I learned to respect it in a way I hadn't before. By the time summer ended, I was more cautious, more aware of the dangers, and more appreciative of safety. The experience stayed with me, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts. They are the real, untamed world around you, indifferent and unpredictable. I left that summer with a mix of relief and pride. I had faced the forest alone and survived. I had made mistakes, I had been scared, but I had endured. The memory of the dark nights, the strange sounds, and the endless trees stayed with me. A lesson that I had been waiting for summer vacation for months. School had felt heavier than usual that year, and the thought of escaping the city heat and chaos was enough to make me restless. My parents decided we would spend a week at a small cabin near a lake a few hours out of town. They promised peace, nature, and a break from technology. The first day, as we drove through winding roads flanked by towering pines, I felt that mix of excitement and unease I often get when stepping somewhere completely new. The sun slanted in the early evening, painting the forest in gold, and the smell of pine and wet earth filled the air. It should have been comforting, but something about the shadows among the trees made me tense. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. Its wooden frame creaked slightly when the wind hit, and the deck overlooked the lake, which mirrored the fiery sunset. I spent that first evening exploring the edges of the property, noticing small details. The way the ground sloped sharply behind the cabin, the dense thicket of trees to the side, and an abandoned dock across the lake that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I knew immediately that this place was isolated. There was no one around for miles, and the nearest neighbor's cabin was barely visible through the trees. I slept poorly that night. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, and every snapping branch or rustle of leaves seemed louder than it should have been. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the shadows, even though I knew logically there was nothing there. The next morning, I tried to shake off the anxiety. Summer was supposed to be fun. I packed a small bag and decided to explore the area around the lake. The forest around the cabin was dense but not impassable. Birds called overhead, and the occasional chipmunk darted across my path. I followed a small trail I found, which led deeper into the woods. For a while, it was peaceful, almost hypnotic. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the scent of wet soil, the sunlight filtering through branches. But after about an hour, the trail disappeared, replaced by thick underbrush. I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The lake, once visible from the cabin, was now just a distant glimmer through the trees. That's when I first noticed the signs. Small footprints, too large to be a dog, pressed into the soft earth. I thought they might be deer, but their spacing and shape didn't match any animal I knew. My heart started to beat faster. I considered turning back, but curiosity made me follow them. The footprints led me through a narrow pass between two clusters of trees and ended at a small clearing. At first, the clearing looked ordinary. Fallen logs, tall grass, sunlight. Then I saw it, a rusted, overturned boat with scratches and dents, and around it, more prints, some partially washed away by a recent rain. They weren't animal prints. Panic started to creep in. I didn't know who or what had been here. I felt suddenly very small, very exposed. My rational mind told me it was probably some other campers, maybe kids from a nearby town, but something in the air told me otherwise. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling, just the faint whisper of wind through leaves. I snapped a few photos on my phone, more as evidence than anything else, and started back toward the cabin. As I retraced my steps, I realized I had lost the trail. Everything looked unfamiliar. Panic surged. I started to jog, hoping I could find something recognizable. That's when I heard it, the first real sign that I wasn't alone. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, breaking twigs under weight heavier than mine. I froze, straining to listen. My first instinct was to call out, but I couldn't. Something told me that drawing attention would make things worse. I tried to keep calm and remember the route I had taken, but every tree looked the same. The lake remained elusive, hiding behind the thickets. I could feel the eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. The footsteps moved closer. I broke into a run, branches whipping against my arms and face, roots tripping me. My chest burned, and sweat streamed down my face, but I didn't stop. I had to get out of the forest. After what felt like hours, I later found out it was maybe only 20 minutes. I stumbled into a familiar clearing near the edge of the lake. The cabin was just visible through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I neared the cabin, I saw a shadow move along the deck, too large and deliberate to be a trick of light. I froze again, heart hammering. It disappeared as quickly as it appeared. I fumbled with the lock on the cabin door, finally slipping inside and bolting it. Inside, I could hear nothing but my own ragged breathing. My parents were out fetching water from the nearby stream, leaving me alone for what suddenly felt like the first time. I tried to convince myself I had imagined the shadow, the footsteps, everything. I told myself it was just paranoia, a summer scare, but the unease stayed, thick and heavy, pressing in on me. The rest of that day passed slowly. I didn't leave the cabin, even to look at the lake. Every sound outside made me jump. The cracking of a branch, the flap of a bird, the distant hum of insects. At one point, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of clothing or skin, but when I turned, there was nothing. I realized the forest around the cabin didn't feel like it had on the first day. Felt watched. Night came and I forced myself to sleep. I stayed near the window, flashlight on the table beside me, ready to grab it at a moment's notice. The wind rattled the cabin and branches scraped the sides, but I convinced myself it was just that. Still, I didn't sleep well. The next day, I was determined to explore more cautiously. I stayed closer to the cabin, walking the shoreline and marking familiar trees. The lake was calm, deceptively peaceful, reflecting the sky like glass. I even dared to wade into the water, but I kept my back to the forest, unable to shake the feeling that something lingered there. That afternoon, I noticed something disturbing. Small, fresh footprints along the lake's edge, larger than mine, leading toward the woods and stopping abruptly. They were the same size and shape as the ones I had seen the day before. Fear tightened around my chest, but I knew I had to do something practical. I went back to the cabin and found the old, rusted rowboat tied up at the dock. It was wobbly, the wood splintered in places, but it floated. I decided to use it as a temporary safe space. At least in the middle of the lake, I would be able to see anyone approaching. I spent hours drifting near the center, scanning the tree line, but no one appeared. The sun dipped low, and I returned to the cabin as darkness fell. By the third day, I was restless. My parents had gone hiking, and I stayed behind, pretending to read while I really scanned the forest for any sign of movement. That evening, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The front door, locked when I left, was now slightly ajar. I checked the lock. It had been forced. My pulse skyrocketed. I didn't know if it was human or what, but I didn't wait to investigate. I grabbed a baseball bat from the corner, a flashlight, and stayed in the center of the cabin, my back to the wall. I didn't sleep again that night. The following morning, my parents returned. They noticed my pallor and the fear in my eyes. I showed them the ajar door, the disturbed cabin, the footprints outside. My father frowned but tried to stay calm. He insisted we stay together and that we would leave the cabin for the rest of the trip if I insisted. That afternoon, we packed up quickly, leaving most of our things behind, and drove back to the city. Even after I returned home, the unease didn't fully leave. I reviewed the photos I had taken, footprints, the overturned boat, the edge of the clearing, and a chill ran through me. The forest had been alive in a way I hadn't realized, alive in a way that was not friendly. The shadows, the silence, the footprints, they were reminders that I had not been alone, even when I thought I was. I never went back to that cabin. For years, I avoided remote lakes, old cabins, and forests where the trees blocked the sky. Summer vacation had been meant for freedom, relaxation, and exploration, but that week taught me something else. Nature is beautiful, but it is also indifferent, and sometimes isolation can hide something far more dangerous than the wild. The memory is still vivid. I can see the lake in the sunlight, the dense line of trees, the shadows that seem to move on their own. And I remember the feeling that someone or something had been watching me the entire time, patient, silent, and just beyond my reach. It was a fear that was real, grounded in the world, and it was enough to change the way I saw summer forever. I had been waiting for this summer for months. The week before school ended, I packed my bag with all the essentials. A worn-out tent, a heavy sleeping bag, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a small first aid kit, and enough canned food to last a week. My parents had warned me about going too far into the woods alone, but I had grown up in this small town, and I knew the trails like the back of my hand, or so I thought. The morning I left, the sun was already hot on the asphalt roads, and the air smelled like dry grass and gasoline from the passing cars. I loaded my backpack into my old, rusted car and drove toward the trailhead near Lake Ashton. The summer air was thick, and the hum of cicadas filled the sky. The forest edge was a sharp line of green, a mix of pine and oak, and beyond it lay the trails I had explored countless times as a kid. I parked, checked my supplies one last time, and started walking. First, everything felt normal. Birds chirped, squirrels darted from tree to tree, and the path crunched softly under my boots. I kept my map in my pocket, but mostly relied on memory. My plan was simple: hike deeper than I had ever gone, camp near the small, hidden lake I had found last summer, and spend 3 days out in the wilderness. The first day passed uneventfully. I followed the narrow trails, stopped occasionally to drink from my water bottle, and admired the sunlight piercing through the branches, creating patterns on the forest floor. I reached the hidden lake around late afternoon. It was smaller than I remembered, but the water was clear, reflecting the tall trees that lined the shore. I set up my tent near a cluster of pines, careful to stay far from the water's edge in case of unexpected rain. Night fell quickly. I lit a small campfire and cooked a can of beans, the smell filling the quiet air. Sitting there, listening to the wind rustle the leaves and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake, I felt peaceful. But as the stars emerged, one by one, the quiet began to feel heavier, almost suffocating. The rustling of the trees, once soothing, now seemed sharper, like someone or something was moving just out of sight. I shook the thought away and crawled into my tent, pulling my sleeping bag close around me. I told myself the fear was just imagination. The first night was uneasy but uneventful. I woke several times to strange noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, but each time I peered out, nothing was there. By morning, the air had cooled slightly, and the sun made the dew sparkle like tiny diamonds across the grass. I ate some trail mix for breakfast and decided to explore the other side of the lake. The trail there was narrower and overgrown, and the farther I walked, the quieter the forest became. Birds disappeared, insects were scarce, and the only sounds were my boots on the damp earth. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something odd. A tree had fallen across the path recently, and the branches were freshly broken, almost as if something large had pushed through. My heart rate quickened. I had hiked this area many times, and I had never seen such fresh damage. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear or a large deer, but the pattern seemed strange, almost like claws gouged the bark. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a natural accident or a fallen branch. I pressed on, but the feeling of being watched grew. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my skin crawl. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than intended. The trail I thought was familiar started to twist unnaturally, and I struggled to recognize landmarks. Panic began to creep in. I stopped to check my map, and my stomach sank. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and I was lost. The realization hit me harder than I expected. The forest that felt so familiar was now a maze. I tried retracing my steps, but quickly discovered the trails looked different from before. Trees that should have been landmarks were gone, replaced by dense undergrowth. The sunlight filtering through the canopy was dimmer here, and the air felt heavier, damp, and almost suffocating. My backpack felt heavier with each step. I called out, my voice swallowed by the vastness of the woods. No response came, just the echo of my own panic. Hours passed, and the sun began to drop behind the trees. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, twisting and turning in strange shapes. I tried to stay calm, using my flashlight as a guide, but I quickly realized the batteries were running low. I had packed extra, but I had used them the previous night. Darkness was approaching faster than I had anticipated. I stumbled across a shallow ravine, the drop hidden by fallen leaves. My foot slipped, and I scraped my shin against a rock, sharp pain shooting up my leg. I ignored it, pressing on, my pulse racing. Night came faster than I expected. The forest transformed into an almost alien place. The sounds of nocturnal animals were everywhere, but one sound stood out. A low, heavy breathing that didn't match anything I had heard before came from behind me. My flashlight beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness, and I felt trapped in the shadows. I moved cautiously, trying to keep my breathing steady, but every snap of a branch made my heart leap. I kept repeating to myself, stay calm, find the path, get to safety. Suddenly, I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting in the faint light. I froze. They were too low to be a human, too high to be a fox. They blinked, and I realized whatever it was large. Maybe a bear. My legs wanted to run, but I knew panicking would make things worse. I backed away slowly, trying not to make sudden movements. The eyes followed me. The breathing grew louder, the heavy weight of the forest pressing in on me. I remembered the small emergency whistle I carried. I blew it hard. The sharp sound echoed through the trees. The eyes vanished instantly, leaving a suffocating silence behind. I waited, trembling, until I was sure it had gone. I didn't dare look around. Instead, I moved quickly in the opposite direction, slipping and tripping over roots and rocks, guided only by faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Hours passed, and I walked blindly. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at me, and my leg throbbed from the earlier scrape. Just when despair was about to overtake me completely, I heard the faint sound of water. My heart leaped. I followed it, hoping it was the lake I had camped by. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing and saw the glint of moonlight on water. Relief washed over me in a wave so intense I almost cried. The lake was smaller than the one I had camped near, but it was a landmark I recognized. I didn't stop to think about how I got there. I just needed to rest. I collapsed near the shore, too exhausted to set up my tent properly. I pulled my sleeping bag over myself and lay on the damp ground, shivering from exhaustion and fear. The night stretched endlessly, each sound magnified in the dark. I kept my flashlight close, though I knew the batteries wouldn't last until morning. When dawn broke, the forest transformed again. The sun's rays cut through the canopy, warming the wet ground. I felt like I had been asleep for days. I looked around, trying to orient myself. By sheer luck, I recognized a trail leading back toward the main path. My legs were stiff and my movements slow, but adrenaline and relief kept me going. The forest, which had felt like a trap the night before, now seemed almost forgiving. Birds sang again, squirrels darted, and the rustle of leaves felt normal once more. I followed the trail for hours, stopping only to rest and drink water from my bottle. The forest gradually thinned, and by late afternoon, I stumbled onto the main road. My car was there, exactly where I had left it, as if it had been waiting for me. I climbed in, my body shaking from exhaustion. I didn't even care about the scratches, bruises, or the dirt covering me. I just needed to get home. Driving back, I kept replaying the previous night in my mind. The fear, the isolation, the unknown presence I couldn't identify. I realized how quickly comfort could turn into terror when you are alone and unprepared. When I finally reached my house, the normal sounds of the neighborhood felt surreal. Children playing, dogs barking, cars passing. All of it seemed overwhelmingly safe compared to the forest. I showered, cleaned my wounds, and sat quietly, staring out the window. I never went back to that hidden lake. The forest, which had once been a place of adventure, had become a place I respected and feared. That summer taught me a harsh lesson. The wilderness is unpredictable, and no amount of familiarity can make you immune to its dangers. From then on, I approached every hike with caution, respect, and preparation, knowing that one wrong step could turn the most peaceful adventure into a night of terror. Even now, every summer when the heat hits and the cicadas hum, I remember that night. The memory lingers, a constant reminder that the line between safety and It was the summer after my junior year of high school, and I had decided to take a solo trip to a small town by the lake. The idea of being alone in nature appealed to me. The thought of escaping the noise of the city and the endless chatter of my family felt like freedom. I wanted to camp, swim in the lake, hike through the woods, and just live in silence for a week. I had rented a small, rustic cabin through an online listing. The pictures looked cozy. Wooden walls, a small porch, a fire pit outside, and it was nestled at the edge of a dense forest, not too far from the lake. I had spent hours planning the trip, making lists of everything I might need, from food to a first aid kit, extra batteries for my flashlight, and a solid knife. The drive there was long. As I left the city behind, the air grew cleaner, and the smell of trees and damp earth replaced the exhaust fumes. Rolling hills and fields stretched on either side, and every mile brought me closer to the kind of quiet I craved. When I finally arrived, the sun was low in the sky, painting everything in golden light. The cabin was even better than I expected. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the wood creaked under my feet, but it gave it character. Inside, the furniture was simple but sturdy, and there was a small kitchen with the basics. A stove, a sink, a few pots and pans. The bed looked soft, the sheets clean. I dropped my bags and opened the windows. The air smelled like pine and wet grass, and I could hear the distant lapping of water from the lake. I spent the first few hours unpacking and exploring the surroundings. The lake was only a 10-minute walk through a narrow path in the woods. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like glass. A few ducks floated near the edge, and I watched them for a while, just enjoying the silence. I set up a small fire pit near the cabin, thinking it would be perfect for the evenings. I stacked some wood I had brought and some I found lying around and lit a small fire. The smoke spiraled up, and the smell of burning wood mixed with the natural scent of the forest. Sitting there, I felt like I had stepped into a completely different world. That first night, I slept well, despite the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and occasionally, a distant animal moved in the underbrush. I was alert but not afraid. I had been camping before, and I knew the sounds of animals. What I didn't know was how unpredictable this summer would become. The next morning, I woke early, the sun filtering through the trees and into my cabin. I decided to hike around the area before swimming in the lake. I packed water, a small snack, and my knife just in case. The forest was dense, filled with towering trees and thick undergrowth. The trail I followed was faint at first, just a narrow path of crushed leaves, but soon it disappeared altogether. I didn't mind. I liked wandering off the beaten path. I was careful, though, marking my route with small piles of stones and broken branches so I could find my way back. I hiked for hours, discovering hidden clearings, old tree stumps, and a stream that I hadn't known existed. The water was crystal clear, flowing over smooth stones, and I stopped to drink from it. I felt alive, more present than I had in months. But as the day wore on, I realized that I had wandered far from the cabin. The sun was high, and shadows shifted, making the forest feel different. The paths looked unfamiliar, the trees all the same in their green density. A knot of unease formed in my stomach, but I reminded myself I had left markers. I retraced my steps slowly, checking each stone pile, each broken branch. It was during that hike that I noticed it, signs that someone else had been in the forest. At first, it was subtle. A piece of torn fabric caught on a branch, a small fire pit with cold ashes that weren't there yesterday. Then I saw footprints in the soft soil near the stream. They weren't recent, but they were clear and human-sized. I paused, listening. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I felt watched, though I knew I was alone. My heart rate quickened. I told myself I was overreacting. People hiked these woods. There was probably a ranger, maybe another camper. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. I felt exhausted, more mentally than physically. I lit the fire again, hoping to relax. I cooked some simple food, bread with canned beans, and ate slowly, trying to calm my mind. But that night, I didn't sleep well. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and I kept imagining shadows moving just outside. I convinced myself it was all normal. The forest is alive after all. But the unease lingered. The following day, I decided to swim in the lake to shake off the anxiety. The water was cold at first, but I soon adjusted, floating on my back and staring at the sky. For a while, I felt peaceful again, letting the sun warm my face. But when I got out and walked along the shore, I saw it. Footprints leading toward the cabin. They weren't mine. They were fresh, small and booted, heading straight for my temporary home. My pulse quickened, and I froze, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a neighbor had wandered near, but the lake was remote, and I hadn't seen a single person since arriving. I ran back to the cabin, adrenaline surging. I locked the door, checked the windows, and stared at the surrounding forest, heart hammering. No one was there. No sound except the usual chirping of insects and the gentle lapping of the lake. I told myself to calm down, that I had likely imagined it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I stayed awake almost the entire time, sitting by the fire with a flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness beyond the porch. The next morning, I planned to hike again, but with more caution. I carried my knife in my hand and kept an eye out for any signs of intruders. I noticed broken branches along the path I had marked the day before, stones moved from my markers, and more footprints, some overlapping mine. The realization hit me. Someone had been following me, possibly even tracking my movements deliberately. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to think clearly. I needed to get out of the forest to reach safety. I packed my things hastily, leaving some food behind. As I made my way back toward the lake, I felt eyes on me. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me freeze. I tried not to panic, but my pace quickened, my breathing shallow. I considered running, but I knew that could make things worse if someone was indeed following me. I kept to the open paths as much as possible, avoiding the thicker underbrush where someone could hide. When I finally reached the lake, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure standing on the opposite shore, partially hidden among the trees. They didn't move much, just watching me. My first instinct was to scream or run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew that any sudden move could provoke them. I slowly backed away, keeping them in sight. Then I ran. I ran toward the main road that led out of the forest, my heart pounding, my legs burning. I didn't look back. I reached the road, which was empty. I followed it for what felt like miles until I finally saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and the driver slowed. I jumped in without explanation, my body shaking uncontrollably. I told them my location, and they agreed to take me to the nearest town. On the way, I kept glancing at the forest. There was no sign of the figure. It was as if they had vanished, melting back into the trees. I spent the rest of the summer in the town, staying at a motel instead of returning to the cabin. I reported what I had seen to the local authorities. They told me that while there had been some reports of trespassers and illegal camping, Nothing concrete had come up in that area. They advised me not to return to the cabin. The feeling of being watched never left me for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the footprints, the broken markers, the figure across the lake. Eventually, I returned home, grateful to be back in the city with people around. The freedom I had sought in the forest had turned into a constant sense of vulnerability and fear. I realized that nature could be beautiful and peaceful, but it could also be unpredictable and unforgiving when humans with unknown intentions are involved. That summer taught me a lesson I would never forget, that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They are other people, lurking quietly, watching, waiting. Even now, years later, I think about that cabin, that lake, and the forest, and I feel a chill remembering how small and exposed I felt. I never returned, and I never will. The thought of being alone in those woods, not knowing who else is there, is more terrifying than any horror story I've ever read. That summer vacation, meant to be the highlight of my life, became a memory of caution and vigilance, a reminder that danger can hide in the most peaceful places. Summer had always been my favorite season. The air felt warm and alive, and the world seemed to open up with endless possibilities. That year, I decided to take a solo vacation. A week in the countryside, away from the city's noise and the constant buzz of people. I had rented a small cabin that sat near a forest edge, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles, a narrow dirt road connecting it to the main highway. The cabin looked isolated in pictures, but I liked that. I wanted silence, space, a chance to disappear for a while. What I didn't expect was how quickly that sense of isolation would shift into something far heavier, far more suffocating than I had imagined. The first day was perfect. I drove the winding road from the highway, passing tall cornfields and scattered farmhouses that seemed almost forgotten. The air smelled like hot grass and wildflowers, a mix I hadn't smelled since childhood summers in my grandmother's village. When I arrived at the cabin, it was exactly as the listing had promised. A small, sturdy wooden structure with a porch, surrounded by a thin line of trees that separated it from the wide open fields. I parked my car and unloaded my bags, noticing the silence around me. There were no birds, no insects buzzing loudly, no signs of people. The wind whispered through the trees, and I told myself that was normal for somewhere so rural. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A small kitchen, a table, a couch, and a single bedroom. Everything was clean, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and pine. I unpacked slowly, feeling a strange relief to be alone. My first night, I lit a few candles and read a book by the window. Outside, the darkness seemed complete. The kind of darkness where you cannot even make out shapes, just a dense black that pressed against the glass. I went to bed early, tired from the drive, and slept deeply. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds, faint but clear. I brewed coffee and walked around the surrounding fields. There was a small dirt path leading into the forest, and I decided to explore it. First, it was relaxing. The sun filtered through the trees, the forest floor covered in dry leaves, small ferns, and wild mushrooms. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer, I guessed maybe raccoons. The air smelled damp but clean, earthy, alive. I kept walking, deeper than I had planned. The path narrowed, the trees thicker, and the sounds of the outside world faded. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where the sunlight hit the ground in golden patches. I paused to take pictures, feeling a thrill at how untouched it all felt. That's when I heard it, a faint snapping sound. It was subtle, like a twig breaking under a footstep, but it didn't fit with the sounds of the forest around me. I stopped, scanning the clearing, but saw nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal. The forest was full of them. I turned back toward the cabin, but then another sound, footsteps. Not in the leaves, but on the dry forest floor, heavier, deliberate. I froze. The sound moved around me in the trees, circling, slow. My heart started to beat faster. I tried to convince myself it was another hiker, maybe a hunter, but something about it didn't feel right. I quickened my pace, moving faster along the path. The footsteps didn't speed up, didn't follow my pace exactly. They just shifted as I moved, always nearby. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, I was sweating, my hands trembling as I unlocked the cabin door. Inside, I checked the locks and windows. Nothing seemed out of place. I sat on the couch, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself I was imagining things, that being alone made every sound seem louder, more threatening. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. Every crack in the wood, every gust of wind through the trees sounded like someone or something moving outside. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see a shadow, a figure, anything. The next day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin. I unpacked my hiking gear but didn't go far. I explored the fields instead, walking the edges where the tall grass bent under the wind. I felt exposed in the open but somehow safer, visible. That's when I noticed it. Tracks in the soft earth near the cabin. They were large, too large for a human, deep impressions that sank several inches into the dirt. I crouched to look closer and realized they weren't from an animal either. Not exactly. Too symmetrical, too deliberate. My stomach sank. I tried to convince myself it was someone else's work, maybe a farmer from nearby, but the cabin was several hundred meters from any other property. The sense of being watched grew heavier with each passing hour. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, I saw movement in the trees near the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it wasn't. It moved upright, slowly, deliberately. I ducked behind the porch railing, heart pounding, trying not to breathe too loud. Then it stopped, as if sensing me. I didn't dare look directly at it, just froze until it eventually vanished into the shadows. I spent the next 2 days inside the cabin. I avoided the forest entirely, only stepping outside when the sun was high. I boarded up windows with spare wood I found in the shed, stacked chairs against the doors, and slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow. Each night, the forest seemed closer, darker, the shadows more alive. The snapping of twigs, rustling of leaves, heavy footsteps that stopped whenever I looked outside. They all made my stomach churn with dread. By the 4th day, I realized I couldn't stay. The thought of spending another night alone in that cabin with whoever or whatever was out there terrified me. I packed my things, but then I saw the tracks again. This time, they led from the edge of the forest directly to my porch. I froze, imagining what could have left them. I didn't care if it was a person or something else. I just wanted out. I decided to leave before nightfall. I started the car and drove toward the highway. The road seemed longer than before, the forest on either side darker, more menacing. Every so often, I caught movement in the rearview mirror, shadows slipping between trees, fast and deliberate. I didn't stop. I drove as fast as I dared, heart racing, until I finally reached a small gas station at the highway intersection. I parked and sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? Someone was following me in the woods, but I didn't see them. I didn't want to sound crazy. After a few hours, I found a motel in the next town. I booked a room for the night and slept fitfully, constantly checking the windows. I didn't leave until morning, and I never went back to that cabin. When I finally returned home, I looked up the area online. Locals mentioned disappearances over the years, hikers who went into that forest and never returned. Nothing official, nothing reported widely, just stories whispered among those who lived nearby. I never figured out exactly what was following me. Maybe it was a person, maybe someone living in the forest, maybe something else. I'll never know for certain, but that summer vacation taught me something I can't forget. Isolation is a dangerous thing. Silence can hide more than peace, and the beauty of nature can conceal threats that no amount of preparation can fully reveal. Even now, years later, I still remember the way the shadows moved in that forest, the sound of deliberate footsteps circling me, the deep, heavy tracks pressed into the earth near my cabin. I never returned to the countryside. I avoid remote places entirely, the fear of being watched too strong, too real. I tell people it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know that's not true. Something was there and it saw me, and for whatever reason, it let me leave. I don't know why I survived. and that uncertainty is worse than anything else. Because if I ever return, I might not be so lucky. I had been looking forward to this summer vacation for months. The year had been grueling, long hours of school, exams, and chores, and the thought of escaping to a small town in the mountains felt like a relief I could almost touch. My parents had rented a cabin near the edge of the forest, not far from a river that twisted through the valley like a silver ribbon. The pictures online made it seem almost perfect. Tall pine trees, a small clearing where you could set up a fire, a porch that overlooked the river. I imagined waking up to the smell of fresh pine, the sun bouncing off the water, and nothing but the sound of birds for hours on end. What I didn't anticipate was how heavy the silence could feel once I was there alone. We arrived on a late Friday afternoon. The drive itself had been long and winding, with roads narrowing as the mountains rose higher around us. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already low, streaking the sky with orange and pink. My parents unpacked the car while I wandered to the edge of the forest. The air was cooler under the canopy, earthy and damp, and the forest smelled of moss and pine needles. I loved the smell, the way it seemed to sink into my clothes, my hair, and even my skin. There was a small trail leading deeper into the trees, uneven with roots poking through the soil. I followed it for a few minutes, imagining myself discovering something exciting or hidden, but I stopped when the shadows lengthened. The woods felt quiet, too quiet, and not in a peaceful way. There was a stillness that pressed against my ears, like the forest was holding its breath. The first night was strange. The cabin was old, wooden, creaking with every gust of wind, every shift in temperature. I could hear the boards settling and the river outside, low and gurgling over stones. But there was another sound too, subtle at first, that made my stomach tighten. It was a scraping noise, soft and deliberate, almost like something large moving against the trees. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. We had been warned about bears in the area, but I didn't think much of it, and sleep finally came, though fitfully. The next day, I decided to explore. I left my parents to settle in and took a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and my phone, even though the reception was terrible. I found a narrow path along the river, stones slippery with moss. The sunlight hit the water in bright streaks, and for a moment I felt safe, almost joyous. I moved carefully, testing each stone before stepping. As I followed the river upstream, I noticed broken branches, flattened grass, and signs of movement that didn't quite fit with normal wildlife. A branch snapped behind me. I froze, scanning the dense trees. Nothing moved, but my heart pounded hard in my chest. I told myself it was just a rabbit or a bird. Still, I quickened my pace, feeling like the forest had changed around me while I wasn't paying attention. It was harder to breathe, the air thicker, and the light seemed to fade more quickly under the trees than it should have. By mid-afternoon, I had walked farther than I expected. The path became less clear, almost disappearing entirely in some spots. I stepped over roots and rocks, the forest growing denser, darker. Then I heard it, a low growl, guttural and not far off. I froze, my stomach dropping. I scanned the trees, and in a small clearing, I caught sight of a dark shape moving through the underbrush. My first thought was a bear, but the shape was smaller, closer to human proportions, though hunched strangely. Panic hit me, and I turned back the way I came. I moved fast now, stumbling over roots, heart hammering, every noise magnified. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Soft, deliberate, not like an animal. I didn't dare look back. I ran, not caring about the path, slipping and scraping my legs and hands on the undergrowth. I didn't stop until I burst back onto the wider trail near the cabin, chest heaving, trembling with adrenaline. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made me tense. I heard movement around the perimeter, small branches snapping, but when I looked, nothing was there. The next morning, I noticed something chilling. My bag from the river trail was moved slightly, the straps tugged as if someone or something had examined it. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, maybe a deer, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something had followed me back, something that knew the area, that could move silently and deliberately. I wanted to tell my parents, but they were busy with chores and unpacking, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Over the next 2 days, I became hyper-aware. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but the curiosity and the need to explore drew me back into the forest. I took a different trail, one that led to a small clearing with a broken-down wooden shed. The shed looked abandoned, but there were signs someone or something had been there recently. Footprints, trampled grass, a faint smell, like smoke mixed with wet earth. I lingered at the edge of the clearing, flashlight ready. That's when I saw them. Faint impressions of a figure in the mud, hunched over, the way the sunlight caught on a patch of hair or fur. It moved quickly, disappearing behind a tree before I could react. I knew then that the thing following me wasn't random. It was studying me, watching me, learning my habits. By the 4th day, I stopped going far at all. I stayed on the cabin porch, reading or sketching in my notebook, the forest looming just beyond the clearing. I could feel eyes on me whenever I looked at the trees. One evening, while the sun was low and the sky was painted in fading orange, I noticed something horrifying. There were deep claw marks on the cabin door, long, deliberate, as if whatever had been watching me wanted to make sure I knew it could reach me. My stomach turned cold. I checked the locks, reinforced the windows with whatever boards I could find. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed alive. I had to be ready. The 5th day, I noticed the food had been disturbed. Not eaten, no, that would have been a bear or a raccoon, but moved, shifted. My peanut butter jar wasn't where I had left it, the bag of bread slightly open. Someone or something was inside the perimeter. I couldn't call for help. There was barely any signal. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered the emergency kit in the cabin. I packed it discreetly, grabbing water, canned food, a small hatchet, and my flashlight. Then I made a plan. If it came closer, I would retreat to the shed by the river, where I could climb up into the rafters for safety. I spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin as best as I could. I put pots on the windowsills, noisemakers along the clearing, anything that might give me a warning. Night came and it was worse than before. The scratching and footsteps were louder, closer. I stayed in the corner of the main room, heart hammering, eyes darting between the darkened windows. Then something slammed against the door. Wood cracked. I grabbed the hatchet and waited, trying to steady my breathing. Came again, harder. The cabin shook under the force. I realized it wasn't an animal, it was too intelligent, too deliberate. Whatever it was, it wanted inside, wanted to confront me. Fear froze me, but I forced myself to move. I slipped out the back door, running into the night, heart in my throat, sprinting toward the river shed. My feet tore through roots and underbrush, branches hitting my face and arms. I didn't look back, but I could hear it following, slower now, careful, stalking. I reached the shed, climbed the small ladder to the loft inside, and held my breath. Outside, I heard the thing circling, sniffing, scratching at the walls, testing my hiding spot. Hours passed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe louder than necessary. At dawn, the sound stopped. I waited until the sun fully rose before climbing down. The forest seemed almost empty now, the oppressive tension gone. It hadn't followed me beyond the clearing. Whatever it was, it stayed within its territory. The next morning, I packed everything I could carry, leaving nothing behind. I walked back to the main road, careful, scanning every tree line. My parents had started to worry, and their relief when they saw me was immense. I didn't tell them everything, not the full truth. They assumed I had explored too far and gotten spooked by wildlife. But I knew better. I had learned something vital. The forest wasn't a backdrop for a vacation. It was alive in a way that didn't care about me, a presence that could stalk silently, deliberately. As we drove away, I glanced back once at the distant trees, tall and unyielding, shadows moving among the trunks. I felt a shiver, a mix of relief and lingering fear. The cabin remained, untouched by humans, but not empty. Something had claimed it, and it would always be waiting. That summer vacation had been beautiful in sunlight, but it had shown me a truth I couldn't unsee. Wilderness is not tame, and sometimes curiosity